Okay, brilliant. I think we're live. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining and welcome to this first in a series of webinars on the subject of raters, the so-called raters active in the ESG space. Many of you will have come into contact with these, and if you have, you'll know that this is a constantly changing space, and that's why we're here. You'll know that you'll know some of the bigger names, but we're going to take a look right now at who they are, what they're doing, some notable events that are happening in the landscape, and in particular around some new regulatory proposals, just to help, as the title suggests, keeping up with the raters. Over the next few months, we'll be dedicating specific webinars to some of the bigger names in this space. And for further information, we are currently developing a short value proposition covering our expertise in the area, which will be made available on our website when complete. So without further ado, Deanna, could you just move to the next slide, please? And we'll give a quick word on housekeeping. So as usual, if you've attended one of our webinars before, the protocol is that you stay muted in listen-only mode. But if you do have any questions, we will be monitoring the question box, as you can see there. And if we have time at the end, we'll come back to answer them. And if not, we can get back to you via email after the webinar is complete. Okay. So by way of some brief introductions, I'm James. I'm a senior consultant here at SLR and our lead on the raters and rankers and investor indices work. I've supported clients with many of the different major raters like the Dow Jones CSA, Sustainalytics, ISS, MSCI, etc. And I also led the development of our disclosure requirement mapping service, which I did a webinar on last year if you're interested in learning a bit more. And I'm also happy to be contacted directly with any rater-related queries. And I'm also joined by David Thatcher here, who will introduce himself.
Thanks, James. My name is David Thatcher. Yes, I'm a director at SLR and I lead on reporting and disclosures. And as James said, there's been some interesting developments recently in terms of the regulation of ESG raters. So I'll be covering that later on in the webinar in some depth.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. Deanna, if we could go to the next slide, please. So straight to the point, who are the raters? We use this term here to describe an industry of organizations, some of which are privately owned, for-profit, and some of them are NGOs, non-profit. They collect sustainability data across the E, S, and G categories, environment, social, and governance. Some of them take into account internal information that the companies provide, and some of them just scrape public information. They collate it and they submit it to portals and questionnaires, and some of them, as you know, have slightly different methodologies and approaches. But what they all do is they take all of this information, whether you're actively submitting it or passively receiving it, and they use it to publish a score or a rating determining essentially a measure of your sustainable performance for key stakeholders to see. So Deanna, if you just click to see the ones on the right, you can see some potentially familiar faces there, just some illustrative examples. And if you click again, some of the names that I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with. So we're already getting a taste of the sort of diversity and sort of range of this industry. If we go on to the next slide here, I think moving on, it's important to understand the value opportunities that these raters present to organizations. So in the middle of that visual right there, you can see first and foremost that the key purpose that they serve is to showcase your sustainable performance, which then leads to a host of other benefits. So at the top there, you know, these scores, these public ratings, they attract key sustainably minded stakeholders, not least investors in your organization, but also prospective talent, NGO partners, academic institutions. And these successful ratings can lead to being listed on the second one here on prominent sustainable indices, such as the Dow Jones Sustainable Indices, the MSCI, the FTSE Russell one. And with the boom in sustainable finance, as you can see by the swift uptick in UNPRI signatories and assets under management coming up to 100 trillion under the PRI responsible investment principles, and Bloomberg's projection of 50 trillion ESG, specifically related assets under management by 2050. This is becoming more and more connected with business success as well. Being listed on these is something that a lot of companies should be going for. Preparation for raters also helps to get your house in order, as you can see at the bottom, by which I mean it encourages business to establish effective governance around their data collection and disclosure practices, but it can also highlight gaps for you and your business, and it can help build a roadmap to having thorough policies, principles, and ultimately practices to improve sustainable performance. And the light in here is turned off. Okay. And finally, in some places, the scores assigned by raters are actually linked directly to things like better interest rates on loans or lines of credit. So, interest rates can go down depending on your sustainable performance, which is demonstrated by some of the scores and grades assigned by these raters. So all the more important to actually get the data out there in a strong way. Deanna, if we could move to the next slide, please. So the landscape right now, put bluntly, is deemed by many to be a bit of a wild west. The industry is largely unregulated, and the sheer number of different rating agencies, the names that we put at the top, the bottom of the previous slide, they're just a fraction of it. The number of different rating agencies and the distinct methodologies that each have can make it a very difficult space to keep track of. So the available methodologies are often confusing, they're constantly changing, and there is as much confusion around what isn't available as what is, which plays into this lacks transparency point at the bottom there. So many participating companies, or even companies that are just having their data scraped by the passive raters, a lot of companies have called for more transparency in the industry around methodological points like the weighting of certain criteria being scored, and more generally the logic behind those scores. So Deanna, if we could just move to the next slide. With that, we can confirm that as of last month, the Council of the EU finalised the text of a proposal to tackle just these concerns. So to help us boil down this lengthy text to the basics, I'll be asking David here a few questions to better understand what the EU hopes to achieve with this new proposed regulation. Okay, Deanna, if we could move to the next slide. Right, David, over to you. What is the thinking behind this proposal?
Thanks, James. Well, I think the backdrop here, as you've sort of really hinted at, is the fact that the EU specifically has got a very ambitious goal, and that is for the European Union itself to be the world's first climate neutral and circular economic bloc by the year 2050. So to achieve that outcome, obviously it's recognised, as you hinted at beforehand, that financial markets play a huge role in channeling, mobilising capital to more sustainable investments. But what's been lacking, and again, you point to that already, is really some consistency and reliability and credibility of the data that can then inform those decisions. So the hope is here, by regulating this market, and you said already, but we should stress again, this is a proposal only. By regulating this market, ESG rating agencies will then be will be obliged to provide more comprehensive information about their assessment processes to enhance the credibility of those processes, and then build trust in the outcome of those processes, which then supports investors and the businesses themselves that are being rated. So that's really it. It's about the EU's own 30-year ambition to be climate neutral by 2050 and how they're going to get there.
Brilliant, thank you. So to follow up on that, most of the big raters that we know are established outside of the EU. So do we know which of these are going to be in scope?
Pretty much all ESG raters are going to be in scope from this proposed regulation. Those domiciled within the EU, but as you said, most of the ones that we're familiar with are HQ'd outside, but the fact they operate in the EU means they fall under the scope of this proposed regulation. There really are only a few exceptions, and that are ESG rating agencies that provide some form of private service. So therefore, the outcome of that assessment is not made public, and therefore the thinking is that, back to the point I made before, investment decisions need to be based on credible data. If that data is not made publicly available, it doesn't need to fall within the scope of this regulation.
Okay, brilliant. And which checks and balances will be implemented to promote compliance with this proposed regulation?
So those ESG raters that fall within the scope of this will have to register with and therefore fall under the supervision of an organisation that exists already called the European Securities Markets Authority. So that's the European equivalent of like the US SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission that regulates financial markets. So that's the first step. ESG rating agencies need to be registered with and then fall under the scope of ESMA. In order to do that, they'll pay a fee, and ESMA also, under this regulation, which is proposed, but it's there, will have the authority to demand from raters any information that it believes it needs to carry out its duties. It can also conduct investigations and audits, and the raters will actually have to pay for that, in addition to that fee for being registered with ESMA. And it can also impose periodic penalty payments for any non-compliance. So this is quite a game changer in terms of the way in which the ESG ratings markets across the EU currently operate.
Great. And how will the regulation approach of so many different, different raters with their own, methodologies and their own logic, how will the regulation approach the challenge of this diversity?
I think it's worth stressing that what's behind this, apart from that grander objective of the EU, is not to actually limit choice, but to actually encourage more informed choice. And that's the case with a lot of regulation that we probably encounter in our day-to-day lives. It's not about limiting choice, it's about just making sure we go into a purchasing decision with more information available. So the regulation itself does actually state, I'm going to quote now, it should not interfere with the ESG rating methodologies or content. Diversity in the methodologies of ESG rating providers ensures that the broad requirements of users can be met and promotes competition in the market. So it's all about competition. So if anything, this initiative, if it happens, will actually see potentially more rating services. But if that doesn't happen, and the same number of rating agencies is there in a year, 2 years down the line, at least there'll be, in a way, a more transparent way in which companies, but also investors using data can interpret the outcome and the outputs of the process.
So it sounds like the methodologies of each will be preserved.
Yeah, very much so. It's not a case of a kind of standardized methodology. It's trying to maintain diversity, but just more transparency.
Absolutely. And so knowing that the new ESMA mandate essentially will be actively monitoring these companies, how does the regulation propose demonstrating its promise of transparency to end users, considering that this is the big issue that stakeholders are calling for?
Yeah, it's certainly the big issue, and I mean the aspiration is that this transparency will promote comparability. As you said beforehand, there's been a concern that methodologies that sit behind these raters are confusing, maybe a little bit opaque. A good example is when a rater may have an individual rating for environment, social, and governance, and a different rater combines those into one single rating across E, S, and G in total, and therefore there may be some weighting that applies, and that's not been perhaps as obvious to those participating in this process as it should be. So certainly the idea is that by being more transparent with methodologies, that'll enable that to happen. There's also within the regulation some sort of baseline thinking here, such that there's a need to more clearly show that the methodologies that sit behind these rating agencies, the approaches that they adopt, are science-based, and align, for example, with the Paris Agreement or other international treaties. So there can be some degree of consistency and comparability at that level as well. And then in terms of this idea of transparency, well, where would, for example, a company go to sort of peek behind the curtain, which they may have been unable to or reluctant to do previously? There actually will be a special European single access point, ESPA, being created as a result of this regulation, and that's there to provide that rigor behind the rating. That's where the methodologies will be effectively hosted and made more easily accessible and more easily open to interpretation by investors and companies that put themselves forward. So that's definitely that idea of ESPA being a single point of access for all this information is what's driving the transparency process here.
So it seems to me that would be quite a radical step then. So there would be this online platform essentially where all raters who want to provide ratings within the EU have to submit this information to this centralized access point. And I think, to my understanding, this would include not only the names, information, financials of these organizations, perhaps not every single score that they give to each company, but certainly the logic, assumptions, and methodologies behind their scoring, and this would be publicly available.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's a case of really what are the fundamentals that investors and companies need to know to make sure this market continues to work effectively. So I think there's a limit to how much information would need to be shared. But as I said beforehand, the core principles of what sits behind the rigor behind the rating, to coin a phrase, is I think what's felt currently is not either as available as it should be, or sometimes just not really something that companies and investors can easily sit down and use to kind of compare. So by having everything in one place and by signaling where ESPA is, that's the ambition behind this, just to make sure there's a single point.
Interesting. And regarding that point that's just at the bottom there, regarding the guardrails, in light of some of these recent reports and the headlines on the previous slide, with general frustrations perhaps with the industry, does the regulation have any plans, potential conflicts of interest within rating agencies? These are some issues that have been flagged in the headlines.
Yeah, again, part of what the regulation is doing is to introduce, or certainly make more open, the idea of there being integrity, which can actually enable more confidence in the output here. You talk about conflicts of interest. The regulation actually uses that exact phrase. They're clearly looking to avoid conflicts of interest that are either are perceived to be within this industry or possibly are as well, and that therefore potentially means that users have less confidence in the output. So specifically in terms of how to address that, any ESG rater under this regulation with a consulting or audit function must keep that ring fence from the rating process itself. So in other words, a consulting firm which operates a rating service cannot then advise a client on how it can improve its score against that rating service that it operates, if that makes sense. So it needs to be, again, ring fenced and clearly sort of demarked in that sense. Benchmarking services are possible. However, within the regulation, it's quite explicit. There needs to be evidence of how that risk of any perceived conflict of interest is managed. So again, that's again a key takeaway from this regulation, the idea that introducing more integrity where perhaps it's been felt there's a lack of integrity as a result of that sort of lack of transparency and certain other sort of characteristics of the market. So that's a key sort of end point as a result of this regulation.
So to clarify, I guess the raters themselves can neither audit the data that is being rated themselves, and they cannot support the companies being rated with any sort of sustainability strategy that might help them improve their score. But if within the confines and adhering to the regulatory proposals, benchmarking services such as peer comparison, i.e. the ranking of the raters and rankers, may be permitted on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and again, it has to be made clear that if there is a potential for risk in terms of conflict of interest, that needs to be, use the phrase guardrails. Those guardrails need to be clearly signaled in terms of how any risk, actual or perceived, it will be managed by that company.
Great. And then finally, yeah, on that last bullet there, do we know, or when do we expect to see this in action if this proposed regulation is passed?
Well, it can be difficult sometimes with policies and regulations that the EU initiates to know exactly when there's an actual end destination. As you said at the beginning of this webinar, really, we found out that this was a finalized draft proposed regulation about a month ago. The expectation is sometime in 2025 we will see this. I think 18 months has been quoted, so that takes us maybe towards the end of 2025. So that's what I'd probably say is the anticipated point at which, if there's no further turbulence, in terms of how this regulation moves through the various sort of corridors of approval, then I would imagine that perhaps Q4 next year is when we might see this coming into fruition.
And do we expect there to be some sort of build-up plan from the point that it's passed, or do we see it coming into force straight away?
There's not much information I know about exactly whether or not it's going to be introduced in a sort of transitional phased approach. I don't know. I certainly know that from reading the regulation and reading around some of the chat around the regulation, it's not expected to be something that upends the market, because as I said beforehand, it's not aimed to try and do that. It's not a case of shaking things up. It's very much about trying to bring some confidence back into the industry. So I think in terms of if you are a company currently being assessed and achieving a rating against some of those raters that you flashed up at the beginning of the webinar, I wouldn't expect there to be any huge upheaval in terms of the process behind or the service you've been getting from that company. This is more about how that rater makes, as I said before, makes the methodology publicly available, or more publicly or more accessible than previously, rather than anything that's really going to necessarily affect the downstream side of this.
Yeah. Okay, so I think what we'll do is we will, in our follow-up to this webinar, present you with these key takeaways as well, and potentially, we'll monitor the situation as it goes forward, and possibly provide some more communications on the subject going forward. So Deanna, if you could take us to the next slide. I just wanted to wrap up with what this could mean, essentially the so what this could mean for the companies being rated. So Deanna, if you could put up the first couple of points there. Ultimately, with serious regulation, as the EU here is presenting and proposing, the transparency and the integrity around the rating activity, the scores given should become more credible. And more credible scores will mean that the data you disclose to achieve them will become more valuable to interested stakeholders. And then if you could put up the next couple there. But given, as we've discussed, that the methodologies are being preserved, the diversity of the markets being preserved and maintained, companies should still be mindful that their disclosures will still consider the different approaches of major raters. So this means, to continue with the Wild West theme, Dan, if you could put the final 2 points up. To continue with this Wild West theme, we could consider appointing what we call data sheriffs to help establish the right controls to get your now more valuable data and disclosures in order. And if done right, there is a real opportunity here to benefit from disclosing sustainability data that is more reflective of your performance and ultimately better for your business. And if you could put up the final thing there, Deanna. There is a real chance to benefit from this here if this regulation is passed. So that sums up what we hope in easy terms, in a sort of whistle-stop tour, broad strokes overview of the landscape, and hopefully some insight into this new proposed regulation. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, and 5 minutes to answer them. So I think the first one to start with here is, do we know if there are any similar proposals in other jurisdictions beyond the EU? I think, David, you've been looking into this.
Yes, yeah, I have actually, yeah. And I think the answer is yes, but I mean, it's a case of probably, as we understand them now, possibly not quite in the same sort of regulatory ballpark. So, for example, the UK, as the EU had done previously, did consult last year, and at the end of 2023, the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the UK's equivalent of the US SEC and the EU's ESMA, the UK government actually was consulting on whether the FCA's regulatory remit should be extended to include something that we're talking about here regarding the EU. So that consultation, and in terms of the government's response to it, hasn't yet been more publicly available, but there's been talk of some more formal proposals in early 2024. And obviously we're now in the third month, 2024. So I think that's a case of watch this space. Whether it becomes a very close mirror to what we're talking about in terms of the EU, and it remains to be seen. But I think that does sound as though with the FCA being involved, it would be more likely to follow what the EU's been doing. And the reason I was sort of saying they're similar but not quite the same is because in other jurisdictions, so in Japan, for example, last year, there was more of a principles code of conduct that was developed. And in Singapore, again, there's been some consultation there, whether that goes down a more principles-based code of conduct or a harder regulatory route remains to be seen. And then more globally, there actually is two organizations, the International Capital Markets Association and the International Regulatory Strategy Group, collaborated last year and developed a voluntary code of conduct. So again, I think it's important to emphasize here the difference between regulation with penalties and a voluntary code of conduct. So I think it's a bit of a sort of a mixed sort of tapestry really of regulation and more light touch regulation. So like I said, interesting space in a way, see whether or not there becomes some kind of global response to this at some point. But right now it seems to be done on a kind of a region by region, territory by territory basis.
Mm-hmm. And if it is passed, we may see the momentum build in more jurisdictions as well with more proposals.
Yeah.
We have 3 minutes. I picked out one question I think would be a good one to wrap up on, and it is simply, what should companies be doing to prepare for this? What first steps? And to this, I would just say, fundamentally, and David has mentioned this, the proposal shouldn't really change the way companies approach data disclosure. Just because the scores published will be underpinned by more transparency, more rigor, more robustness, I think getting your data disclosure right should be a priority right now. This proposal only seeks to make that exercise more valuable. So the most important things to do will and should remain the same. So, first and foremost, establish your reporting needs. So obviously there are centrally mandated disclosure requirements such as the CSRD, and then there are what your key stakeholders want you to disclose, these voluntary ones which serve you best. So this lays the groundwork. Next, you should really find efficiencies to streamline this, because reporting burdens are something familiar to a lot of us. So mapping exercises and finding the right support to do this takes the burden off you to mitigate the risk of reporting overload. And as disclosed data becomes more valuable, this exercise will become more important. And then ultimately, just start early. There is no time like the present. Prioritizing and mapping now will prepare you for any updates down the road. And to tie it back to that point earlier around getting your house in order, these exercises will result in not only improved scores and performances across these raters, but also they will result in a far deeper understanding for you of your sustainable businesses and what opportunities you have to improve that in future years.
I would agree. And actually, just you mentioned before about the Wild West analogy at the beginning and at the end of the session, and to maybe extend that a little bit. I mean, there's kind of gold in those hills there. The data that the companies are sitting on is really gold, but there's obviously maybe some help there in prospecting and making sure you actually can unlock the benefits of that data you're collecting, and making sure that you're able to present a narrative that drives the dividend home. So I think that's an important thing to take away, is making sure that you're on top of the data you've got and actually getting the most out of it.
Absolutely. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you everyone for listening. This has been recorded. We'll send that with the follow-up. And we are very excited to say that next month there will be a webinar on the Dow Jones Sustainability Indices, or the Corporate Sustainability Assessment. So we will be in touch with more information about that for those of you who are interested in joining. Fantastic. All right. Well, then I wish everybody a brilliant afternoon. Yeah, I think we can call it right there. Deanna, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jam.